Thomas Bennett slammed his daughter's hand onto Nathaniel Whitmore's desk like he was settling a debt with livestock. "She's 19, healthy, educated. Take her and burn that note." Clara did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked straight at the blind man across the desk and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I will not beg you to refuse him, but I am asking you man to man, do not let him win." Nathaniel's scarred hand found the paper, and slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. "If this story moves something in you, subscribe, stay until the very end, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far Clara's story travels." Thomas Bennett had rehearsed what he would say for 3 days. He had stood in front of the cracked mirror above his wash basin and practiced the words the way a man practices a prayer. He does not believe in with his eyes closed and his voice low, hoping that if he said it enough times, it would stop sounding like what it was. It still sounded like what it was. He rode the 14 miles from his failing farm to Whitmore Estate on a horse that hadn't been properly fed in 2 weeks. The animal moved slow, ribs visible beneath its coat, and Thomas did not notice. He was too busy rehearsing. "It's a business arrangement. It's practical. The girl will have a roof over her head. She'll be provided for. It's more than I can give her now." Clara rode beside him on a borrowed mule, her good dress pressed as well as she could manage, her hair pinned back the way her mother used to wear hers. She had not been told exactly what was happening. She had been told only to dress well, to be respectful, and to not ask questions until they arrived. She had been asking questions in her head for 14 miles. "Papa," she said when the iron gates of Whitmore Estate came into view through the trees, "tell me what we're riding toward." Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "A business arrangement." "What kind of business arrangement requires me to come along in my good dress?" "The kind that keeps us from losing the farm entirely." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting until we get inside." She did not push further, but her hands tightened on the reins and her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She had heard things about Nathaniel Whitmore. Everyone in Harlan County had. He had been the most powerful man in the region before the accident, a man whose name was spoken with a particular combination of envy and respect that only the very wealthy commanded. His father had built Whitmore Estate before the turn of the century, and Nathaniel had grown it into something formidable, hundreds of acres of Kentucky land, a working mill, tobacco fields, horses. Then 3 years ago, he had taken a fall from a horse during a storm. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said the horse had thrown him on purpose, spooked by lightning. Some said he had been riding recklessly. Some said it didn't matter how it happened, because what mattered was the result. Nathaniel Whitmore could no longer see. Not completely blind, the rumors said. Not entirely, but close enough that he had retreated from public life with the thoroughness of a man who intended never to return. He had fired half his staff. He had stopped attending church. He had turned away visitors. He had let the estate run itself, or rather, he had let the men who claimed to be running it do as they pleased, which was not the same thing at all. Clara had always thought it was a tragedy. Now, riding through the iron gates of his property, she was beginning to think it might also be her fate. The house was large and gray in the November morning, solid and proud, and slightly neglected in the way that came from a man with money, but no will. The porch railing needed painting. The flower beds along the front walk had gone untended so long they were barely distinguishable from the surrounding ground. But the bones of the place were beautiful. That was what struck Clara, not the decay, but what was underneath it. The house wanted tending. It had been built to be cared for, and it was waiting. She did not know then that she was thinking the same thing about its owner. A servant met them at the door. A thin, older man named Ellis, who had the particular expression of someone who had long ago made peace with being embarrassed by his employer's choices. He took their horses without comment, showed them into a front parlor, and told them Mr. Whitmore would see them shortly. He said, "See them," without flinching, which told Clara the man had been practicing that phrase for 3 years. She sat in the parlor and looked at the shelves. Books. Many of them, and recently read, based on the placement, not decorative, not dusted and arranged for show, but pulled and returned at uneven angles markers left inside. She noticed a Bible, a collection of surveying texts, several volumes on agriculture. He had not stopped thinking then. Whatever the world assumed about a blind man shut up in his house, Nathaniel Whitmore had not stopped using his mind. "What are we here to discuss, Papa?" It was not a question this time. Thomas had his hat in his hands. He was turning it around and around, which was what he did when he was lying or about to. "I've negotiated an arrangement with Mr. Whitmore that will clear our debt and secure your future." "What arrangement?" "You'll stay on at the estate, as a companion, an assistant. He needs someone who can read for him, manage correspondence, help with the running of the household accounts." Clara stared at him. "You're offering me as hired help." "I'm offering you a position." "Without asking me." "Clara, without telling me. For 14 miles, Papa, you let me ride next to you, and you said nothing." Her voice was very quiet, which was how it got when she was most furious. Her mother had had the same quality. Thomas had never been comfortable with it in his wife, and he was less comfortable with it in his daughter. "What does he get in return, Mr. Whitmore? What does he give you for bringing me here?" Thomas looked at his hat. "The debt is forgiven." "How much?" "That's not..." "How much, Papa?" $400. Clara heard the number and felt something settle inside her chest. Not peace, but clarity. The kind that comes when you stop wondering and start knowing. "And what am I supposed to receive in return for becoming this man's property?" "You're not his property. You'd have room and board, a wage. You bartered me. You put a price on me, and you didn't even ask." She stood. $400. "Clara, we have no other option. The creditors will take the land by February. We'll have nothing. Your brothers will have nothing." "Then let them take it." She said it simply, without drama. "It's land, Papa. It can be rebuilt. You cannot buy back what you're selling right now." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Sit down. He'll hear you." "Good," Clara said. "Let him." Nathaniel Whitmore heard her. He had been standing in the hallway outside the parlor for approximately 2 minutes, which was long enough. Ellis had come to fetch him when the guests arrived, and Nathaniel had walked down from his study with the slow, careful precision that had become his way of moving through a house he had memorized, step by step, the 6th stair that creaked, the corner of the hall table that caught his hip. If he wasn't careful, the parlor door that hung slightly off-center and had to be pushed firm. He had stopped when he heard voices. He listened without intending to. He had been listening to things he wasn't meant to hear for 3 years. It was what happened when you lost one sense. The others sharpened without being asked. $400. He heard the number. He heard the father's voice, thick with justification, and he heard the daughter's voice, which was something else entirely. Quiet and precise and furious in the way of someone who did not need to raise their volume to be devastating. "You cannot buy back what you're selling right now." He pushed open the parlor door. The girl turned first. She did not step back. She did not go polite or timid the way most people went when he walked into a room, that particular flinch of discomfort that he had come to recognize without seeing it, the small pulling back that came from not knowing how to look at someone who could not look back. She did not flinch. She looked at him. He could feel the directness of it, the measurement in it, the refusal to pretend. "Mr. Whitmore," the father said, getting to his feet, his hat mangled in his hands. "Thomas Bennett. We had a correspondence about the—" "I know who you are," Nathaniel said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. 3 years of talking mostly to Ellis and to the walls of his study had done that. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Thomas sat. The girl did not. She remained standing, which Nathaniel registered with something he had not felt in a long time. Interest. He walked to the chair across from the settee and found it without reaching for it. He knew this room and sat. He let the silence breathe for a moment before he spoke. "Miss Bennett," he said, "your father has written to me twice about a financial arrangement. I assume you're aware of the general nature of what's being proposed." "I am now," she said. "And what do you think of it?" A pause. He could hear her deciding something. "I think my father had no right to propose it without my knowledge. And I think you'd be getting a very poor bargain if you expect someone who was brought here without her consent to serve you willingly. Thomas said, "Clara." "Let her speak," Nathaniel said. Another pause. He heard her take a breath, not a nervous breath, but a settling one. She was steadying herself, preparing to be honest with someone she had every reason not to trust. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I don't know you. I don't know if you're a good man or a cruel one. But I know that any arrangement that treats a woman as currency instead of a person is not a business arrangement. It is a transaction in human beings. And I was raised to believe that those are wrong, regardless of what either of us needs." The room was very quiet. Thomas Bennett looked as though he might swallow his own hat. Nathaniel sat with his hands resting on his knees and looked at the place in the room where he could feel her standing, and he thought about the last 3 years. He thought about Ellis bringing him the account books and reading them aloud with patient, careful inaccuracy, because Ellis had been with the family for 40 years and was a loyal man, but he was not educated, and numbers had never been his strong suit. He thought about the 2 managers he had dismissed for stealing. He thought about the fields he could no longer walk himself, the horses he could no longer evaluate, the slow, steady erosion of everything his father had built, because he had spent 3 years in a dark room, telling himself his life was finished. He thought about the way she had said it. "You cannot buy back what you're selling right now." She was not wrong. "Mr. Bennett," he said at last. "Sir," Thomas said, eager. "Your debt to me is forgiven." The man exhaled. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't thank you. I'm not finished." Nathaniel turned his face toward where the girl was standing. "Miss Bennett, your father's debt is cleared. You are free to leave with him, return home, and I will not contact your family again. That option is on the table, and it will remain there. No obligation, no condition." He heard her say nothing. "However," he continued, "I do need someone who can read, who can manage correspondence and account books, who can function as the eyes that I am currently not using well enough on my own." He said it flatly, without self-pity, which cost him something. He was aware of that. "I am prepared to offer a fair wage, proper accommodation, and complete respect for your person. You would be an employee, not a companion, not a ward. An employee with a contract legally binding, subject to termination by either party with 2 weeks' notice." "That is a different offer than my father made," Clara said. "It is." "Why?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Because you were right," he said. "What was proposed to me was a transaction in human beings, and I should have said so in my first reply to your father's letter, instead of being more interested in solving my problem than in examining how it was being solved." The silence this time was different, softer. "Will you think about it?" he asked. Clara Bennett looked at him for a long moment, and he could not see her face, could not read her expression, could only feel the weight of her considering him. And then she said something that surprised him. "I don't need to think about it." Thomas made a small sound of relief. "I'll take the position," she said. "But I want the contract in writing before I unpack a single thing. And I want the terms clear, wage, duties, hours, and a specific clause stating that my father has no claim to any portion of my earnings." Thomas said, "Clara, now." "Those are my terms," she said simply. "If they're acceptable, I'll stay. If not, I'll walk back to Harlan on my own 2 feet. Nathaniel Whitmore almost smiled. It was the first time in 3 years that anything had come close to making him do that. "Ellis," he called. Ellis appeared in the doorway with the particular swiftness of a man who had definitely been listening from the hall. "Sir?" "Bring the ledger book and ink." He turned back toward Clara. "We'll write it down together, Miss Bennett, every word." The first week was not easy. Clara had expected the work. She had not expected the silence. Whitmore Estate operated on a particular code of quiet, not peaceful quiet, but avoidant quiet. The kind that accumulates in a place where the man in charge has stopped speaking and everyone else has taken the cue. The house staff, what remained of them. Ellis, a cook named Martha, who communicated primarily in nods, and 2 farmhands, who rarely came indoors, moved through their days with the minimal interaction of people who had been discouraged from conversation for long enough that they had forgotten how to start one. Clara had been raised in a loud house. 4 brothers, a mother who sang while she cooked, a father who had been warm and funny before the debts had worn him down to something else. Silence to her was not a natural state. It was a symptom. She started in the account books. The estate's finances were in a state that upon examination made her stomach turn. Not from poverty there was money, or there had been. But there were inconsistencies everywhere she looked. Payments recorded that did not correspond to dates. Wages logged for workers who, when she checked the staff roster, had not been employed by Whitmore Estate for over a year. Purchases of materials that should have been visible lumber seat equipment that she could find no evidence of having arrived. She went to Nathaniel on the 3rd day. He was in his study, which smelled of leather and wood smoke, and he was sitting in a large chair near the window. Not for the light, she understood quickly, but for the warmth. His eyes were open, directed toward the glass, taking in whatever blurred shapes and shadows remained to him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I need to ask you about the account books." "What about them?" "When did you last have them reviewed by someone outside the estate?" A pause. "My previous manager kept the books, Harrison. I dismissed him 6 months ago." "And before you dismissed him, when did you personally go through the records?" Another pause, longer. "I haven't been able to go through records personally in—" He stopped. "In 3 years, Clara said quietly. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Say what you're saying, Miss Bennett. Someone has been stealing from you, consistently over a period of, from what I can tell, at least 2 years, possibly longer." She set the ledger on the desk in front of him, a gesture she realized immediately was habit, not practical. "I'm sorry, I can read it to you, the specific entries." "Do that," he said. She read them. Every irregularity, every false entry, every payment that didn't add up. She read them without editorializing, without softening, without rushing. She simply read the numbers and let the numbers be what they were. When she finished, the room was very still. "How much?" Nathaniel said. She told him. He did not react visibly. He sat with his hands on the armrests of his chair, and she watched something move through his face. Not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but something that lived between them. The expression of a man who has learned that while he was standing still, the world was moving without him and not in his favor. "Harrison is still in the county," he said finally. "Yes." "And the current manager, Silas." Clara had been waiting for this. "Mr. Whitmore, I went through Silas's records separately from this past year, and I found—" She steadied herself. "I found similar patterns." He was quiet for a very long time. "2 of them," he said. "Working in different years. I don't know if they coordinated or if Silas simply saw an opportunity when Harrison left." She paused. "But you should know. This is not a small amount of money. And if this continues—" "It won't continue," Nathaniel said. His voice had changed. The roughness was still there, but underneath it something had sharpened. Something that reminded Clara very briefly that this man had once run this estate in a way that made other landowners step carefully around him. "Miss Bennett, I need you to write a letter for me. 2 letters, in fact. One to my solicitor in Lexington, one to the county sheriff." Clara picked up the pen. "And then," Nathaniel said, "I want you to go over every record this estate has produced in the past 3 years. Every page. I want to know exactly what was taken and exactly how it was done. That will take some time. Take it." He finally moved, turned his face toward her, not quite meeting her eyes, but closed the way he did when he was speaking to her directly, rather than to the room. "You're the first person in this house in 3 years who has told me the truth. I'd like to keep that going." Clara looked at him. "I'll get you the truth, Mr. Whitmore." "I know you will," he said. "That's why I agreed to your terms." Silas was dismissed by the end of the week. He did not go quietly. There was a scene in the front yard that Ellis described to Clara afterward, in low, careful detail. The way you described something that had upset you, but that you had been trained not to show affected you. Silas had shouted. He had made threats. He had called Nathaniel names that Clara would not repeat, and that Nathaniel had stood through without moving, his hands clasped behind his back until Silas had run out of words and had nothing left but to climb into his wagon and go. "He didn't say anything?" Clara asked. "Mr. Whitmore, during all of it?" "Not one word," Ellis said. There was something in the old man's expression, a kind of quieted relief. Not one word the entire time. That evening she brought Nathaniel his dinner in the study, rather than making him find his way to the dining room, which he did every night with a careful, slightly pained dignity that she had not commented on and did not intend to. He looked up when she came in. "I heard you speaking to Ellis." "I didn't think it was a secret." "It isn't." He paused. "You wanted to know why I didn't speak." "I was curious, because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said." He reached for the tray with a certainty that told her Ellis had been putting it in the same place for years. "Silas wanted a reaction from me. He wanted evidence that I was still capable of being undone. I had no interest in giving him that." Clara sat in the chair across from him without being invited. She was starting to understand that he didn't mind that the rigid formality of the house was not his preference but his protection, and that when someone simply acted as though things were normal, some of the protection loosened. "The men in the south field," she said. "Josiah and the others. They're working in rotations that make no sense for the season, and they haven't been paid correctly in at least 2 months. Who told you that?" "Josiah, when I brought out water yesterday morning. He was surprised I asked." She paused. "Actually, I think he was surprised anyone asked." Nathaniel set down his fork. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't. I should have known." "You couldn't walk the fields," she said simply. "And the people who were walking them for you were not walking them on your behalf." Howe was quiet. She could see him thinking the way his expression worked when he was moving through something internally, the slight tension around his eyes. "What would you have me do about it?" "Pay them what they're owed, all of it this week, and talk to them." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, those men have been working this land faithfully through 3 years of mismanagement. They know this estate. They know what it needs, but they've been treated like furniture, like things that operate on their own without requiring acknowledgement." She paused. "You need them, more than they need you right now, and I think they know it." Nathaniel was very quiet for a long time. "You've been here 1 week." "Yes, sir." "And you've reorganized my account books, discovered 2 instances of active theft, managed the dismissal of my second manager in 6 months, established some kind of rapport with my field workers, and are now recommending I have a conversation with people I've been avoiding for 3 years. I wasn't going to put it quite that way." "How were you going to put it?" "I was going to say that I think Whitmore Estate is a remarkable piece of land, and I think you're a remarkable man, and I think both of you have been in the dark for long enough." She paused. Figuratively speaking. The silence stretched. And then for the first time, Clara heard Nathaniel Whitmore laugh. It was short and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used recently and needed to find its range, but it was real. "Figuratively speaking," he repeated. "I didn't mean to make a—" "Don't apologize," he said. "Don't ever apologize for saying a true thing." He picked up his fork again. "I'll speak with Josiah in the morning." I did. It was nothing like the effortless command of a man in his prime, and Clara did not pretend otherwise, and neither did he. He walked to the south field with Ellis and with Clara. Slightly behind, she had offered to accompany him, and he had not refused, which she took as the permission it was, and he spoke to the men with a plain honesty that was not performed. He told them he had not been paying adequate attention. He told them he intended to change that. He told them their back wages would be corrected by Friday. Josiah, a large, quiet man, who looked like he had been expecting this conversation for approximately 3 years, listened to all of it, and then said simply, "We appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore." "I imagine you appreciate it more than I deserve," Nathaniel said. "Maybe," Josiah said. "But we're still here. That ought to count for something." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "It counts for more than something." Walking back to the house. Clara did not say anything. She simply walked beside him, watching where she was going, not offering her arm unless he wanted it, which he did not. He knew this path. He had walked it 1,000 times. After a while, he said without turning toward her, "You were right." "I usually am," she said. "But you didn't hear that from me." He almost laughed again. She could see it happen and not quite complete itself, the edge of something lightening in his face. "Miss Bennett?" "Mr. Whitmore." "Why did you stay?" He said it as though he had been carrying the question for several days. "That first morning, after I gave you the option to leave, you didn't need to stay. The debt was cleared regardless." Clara thought about it as they walked. The truth was that she had been asking herself the same question since she'd said, "I'll take the position," and she was still working out the complete answer. But she had the beginning of one. "Because I looked at this house," she said, "and I saw something that had been left to fall apart by people who were supposed to be caring for it. And I thought that was wrong. And I didn't want to be one more person who just left it that way." Nathaniel said nothing. "And because," she added more quietly, "when you sat across from my father and said the debt was forgiven before any condition, before any arrangement. I thought that was the action of a man who was trying to be decent, even when decency was costing him something." He was still for a moment. "It cost me quite a lot," he said. $400 specifically." "And did you regret it?" A long pause. "No," he said. "I did not." The second week she started teaching him the account books by touch. It was her own idea, and she brought it to him carefully, not sure how he would receive it. She had been thinking about the way he navigated the house by memory, by feel, by the certain placement of objects that hadn't moved. She had been thinking about his books, which he clearly could not read anymore, but which he clearly missed based on the way his hands would rest on the covers sometimes when he was sitting and thinking. "If the columns were raised," she said, "if I used a thick enough ink and pressed hard enough into the page, you might be able to trace the figures by feel. It wouldn't be fast, but it would give you direct access to the numbers without needing me to read them aloud." He was quiet for a moment. "That won't work. The figures are too complex." "Not all of them. The primary tallies, the monthly totals. You could check my work." Another pause. "You're suggesting I check your work because you want me to be able to verify the accounts independently." He said it slowly. "Not because you think I'll find an error." "No." "Then why?" Clara picked her words carefully. "Because there is a difference between a man who has an employee managing his estate and a man who manages his own estate with some assistance. And I think you used to be the second kind of man. And I think you can be again." Nathaniel sat with this for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might refuse or deflect or say something that closed the subject. Instead, he said, "Show me." She showed him. It took the better part of an afternoon, and it was imperfect. She could see the frustration in him. When the method didn't work for certain figures, when his fingertips slid and lost the marks, when the texture of the paper varied in ways that confused the information. He did not throw anything. He did not curse. He simply said, "Again," and they tried again. By the end of the afternoon, he could read the monthly totals. He sat with his fingers on the final column for a long moment, feeling the numbers, and Clara watched his face and said nothing. When he pulled his hand back, his expression was the complicated one, the one she had started to learn, the one that meant he was feeling something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you." He said it plainly, without ceremony, without the slight awkwardness that thank you usually carried when he aimed it at her. Just simply directly like it was true. "Thank you." Clara picked up the ledger and straightened the pages. "We'll work on the weekly tallies next." "Of course," Nathaniel said. And he was quiet, but the room felt different than it had 2 weeks ago. Fuller. Like something had been opened rather than closed. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare trees of Whitmore Estate, and the fields stretched out under a pewter sky, still and waiting. The house itself seemed to breathe a little easier. Clara did not notice that she was beginning to do the same. The contract was signed before Thomas Bennett's horse was cold. Clara had written it herself, every word, every clause, her own hand steady on the page, even as her father sat across the room, pretending he had not just sold her like a field mule. She wrote the wage. She wrote the duties. She wrote the clause about her earnings being her own, no claim from any blood relation, and she read that line aloud twice before she signed it. Nathaniel sat across the desk and listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Ellis, witness." Ellis witnessed it. Thomas Bennett signed as the releasing party, which was a phrase Clara had chosen deliberately, and she watched something move across her father's face when the pen touched paper. Not guilt exactly, but the cousin of it. The kind of discomfort a man feels when the thing he has done is named correctly. She did not look at him after that. Thomas left within the hour. He did not embrace her. He touched her shoulder once briefly, the way you touch something. "You are returning to a shelf," and then he walked out through the front door, and Clara heard his horse on the gravel drive, and then nothing. She stood in the front hallway of Whitmore Estate, with a signed contract in her hand, and everything she owned in a single bag at her feet, and she breathed. Ellis appeared beside her, with the particular quietness of a man who had learned that presence was sometimes more useful than words. "I'll show you to your room, Miss Bennett." "Thank you, Ellis." "It's a good room," he said almost apologetically. "South-facing, gets the morning light." Clara picked up her bag. "That'll do fine." She did not cry. She had made herself a promise about that on the 14-mile ride, and she intended to keep it. She cried a little later alone in the south-facing room, with the door closed quietly and briefly, because she was 19 years old, and she was in a stranger's house, and her father had ridden away without looking back. She allowed herself exactly enough time for it to be human, and then she washed her face and went back to work. That was the thing about Clara Bennett that most people had never understood, and that Nathaniel Whitmore was about to learn. She did not stop. Whatever hit her, she absorbed it, processed it, and kept moving. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was more like she had decided very young that the world was going to keep turning whether she cooperated or not, and she preferred to be the kind of person who kept up. She started with the kitchen. Not because it was her job. Because Martha the cook was approximately 60 years old and had been managing the household meals on a budget that had been quietly shrinking for 2 years without anyone telling her why, and Clara had noticed the woman measuring flour with the careful precision of someone who knows she cannot afford to waste a grain. She sat at the kitchen table that first evening and said simply, "Tell me what you need." Martha looked at her like no one had asked that question in recent memory. "Beg pardon." "For the kitchen. For the house. Tell me what's short, what's been cut, what you've been making do without." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from Clara and told her. It took a while. By the time Martha finished, Clara had 2 pages of notes and a considerably clearer picture of exactly how deeply the estate's mismanagement ran. It was not just the account books. It was everything: the supply orders that had been halved, and the difference pocketed the equipment that needed repair and hadn't been touched. The small daily deprivations that accumulated into something that wore people down slowly. The way water wears stone, without any single moment you could point to and say there, that was when it broke. "How long has Mr. Whitmore known?" Clara asked. Martha looked at her hands. "Mr. Whitmore hasn't asked about the kitchen in 2 years, miss." Clara wrote that down too. She brought it to Nathaniel the next morning. All of it, not just the account books, not just the financial fraud, but the full picture of what 3 years of absence had done to the living machinery of his home. She read it to him without softening any of it, and she watched his face change as she went moving through something she couldn't fully name: anger and grief, and something underneath both of those that was older and quieter. When she finished, he said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, "How bad is it?" "The land is still sound," she said. "The fields are producing less than they should, but that's management, not soil. The house staff are loyal. The ones who stayed are loyal, I mean. They stayed because they believe in this place. But they've been working without proper support for long enough that a few more months of this and you'll start losing them too." She paused. "The financial damage from Harrison and Silas together, I have a figure now. Do you want it?" "Give it to me." She gave it to him. He absorbed it the way he'd absorbed everything she'd told him, completely. Still hands on his knees, face forward. A man receiving bad news, like a man not performing it. She respected that, even when it made her ache a little to watch. "It can be recovered," she said. "It will take time. But the land is good, Mr. Whitmore. The foundation is good. This is a repairable situation." "You sound very certain of that." "I am certain of it. You've been here 4 days. I've been managing my father's book since I was 14, she said. I know what a broken thing looks like, and I know what a salvageable one looks like. This is salvageable." He was quiet again, and then slowly he said, "What would you do first?" It was not a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking, and that was the moment Clara understood that the man sitting across from her was not the broken, retreated figure that Harlan County gossiped about. He was a man who had lost his footing and was looking very carefully for a way to find it again. She told him what she would do first, and then second, and then third. She talked for 20 minutes, and he listened to every word, and when she finished he said, "Do it." And she said, "I'll need your authorization on some of these." And he said, "You'll have it." And that was how Clara Bennett became in practical effect the managing force behind Whitmore Estate on day 4 of her employment. She was 19 years old. She had never managed anything larger than her father's failing farm. She was not remotely frightened. That should have worried her more than it did. What happened in the 3rd week was not something Clara had planned for. She had been making a habit of working late in the study. Nathaniel kept irregular hours, another symptom of a man who had spent 3 years with no particular reason to observe a schedule, and she had simply matched her pace to his, rather than fighting it. It was past 10 o'clock when she heard him in the hallway, moving with the familiar measured care that she had by now mapped without meaning to. The way his right hand would graze the wall, without quite touching it, maintaining orientation. The way he counted steps she couldn't hear but knew he was counting. He came to the study doorway and stopped. "You're still here. The quarterly projections won't write themselves." "They wrote themselves just fine before you arrived," he said. Incorrectly, but consistently. Clara almost smiled. His dry humor came out in the evenings she'd noticed. In the mornings he was all business, contained and precise. By night, with the house quiet and the pressure of being observed, lifted something in him loosened slightly. "I found another irregularity in the harvest records from last October." "Of course you did. Do you want to hear it now or in the morning?" "Now." He came fully into the study and found his chair directly without hesitation, which he hadn't been able to do that first morning. She had noticed. She had said nothing. "Tell me," she told him. And then, because the hour was late, and the fire was low, and she was tired enough that her usual careful editing had loosened, she said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the accounts?" A pause. "That depends on the question. How long after the accident did it take you to learn the house by touch?" The silence was a different kind. Careful. Not refusing exactly, more like deciding how much to give. 6 months, he said finally. "For this floor. The upper floor took longer. I still avoid the east wing." "Why?" "Because I haven't memorized it yet and I don't—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't enjoy moving through spaces I can't anticipate." Clara considered this. "That makes sense. You're not going to tell me I should try more." "Why would I? You've been managing in this house for 3 years with what you have available to you. You don't need me to assign you challenges." She set down her pen. "What I was actually thinking is that I could describe the east wing to you. Not walk you through it, just describe it. The layout, the distances. You could map it in your head first." He was very still. "That's an unusual offer." "I'm an unusual employee." Something shifted in his face. Just briefly, the edge of something. "Why do you care about the east wing?" "I don't particularly. I care about you not having to avoid spaces in your own home." She picked her pen back up. "But it can wait. The quarterly projections cannot." He said nothing. But he stayed in the study for another hour, and he did not go to bed when she thought he would. And twice she looked up from the ledger and found him sitting with his hands quiet in his lap, not restless, not performing presence, just there. Comfortable in a way she was fairly sure he had not been comfortable in a long time. She did not comment on it. She let it be what it was. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after Clara had sent the formal complaint to the county sheriff, and a detailed accounting to the solicitor in Lexington. She brought it to Nathaniel at breakfast. "Harrison has been located," she said. "He's in Boyle County. The sheriff there has been notified, and the solicitor says the case for recovery of funds is strong. He wants your signature on 3 documents, and he'll begin proceedings." Nathaniel set down his coffee. "And Silas. Still in the county, apparently. The sheriff here has already spoken with him." She paused. "He's claiming the accounting errors were mistakes, not theft." "Of course he is. Your solicitor expected that. He says the documentation is sufficient to counter it." She put the letter on the desk. "This is going to become a public matter, Mr. Whitmore. When it goes to proceedings, people will know." He was quiet. "Let them know. Some of them will be unkind about it. A blind man who didn't know his own accounts were being robbed." She said it plainly, not cruelly, because dancing around it would have been an insult to both of them. "There will be talk." "There's already talk," Nathaniel said. "There has been for 3 years. I am well practiced in being the subject of other people's conclusions." He reached for the letter, stopped short of it, then adjusted and found it and held it. "Schedule the documents with the solicitor. I'll sign whatever is needed. I'll ride to Lexington tomorrow if you'd like." He looked up at that. "You'd do that?" "It's 12 miles. I've ridden worse. Alone. I'll take one of the farmhands if it makes you feel better." She paused. "Does it make you feel better?" "Yes," he said, which surprised her a little with its honesty. "Take Josiah." She took Josiah. They rode to Lexington and back in one day. She signed what needed signing on Nathaniel's behalf with his written authorization, and she returned to Whitmore Estate at dusk with her face windburned and her back aching and the documents correctly filed. She found Nathaniel on the front porch, standing. Not sitting, standing, which was unusual for him in an exposed space where the variables were higher and the footing less certain. She swung down from the horse, and Josiah took both animals to the stable. She walked up the porch steps and stopped beside Nathaniel, and they stood there for a moment in the November cold. "How did it go?" he said. "Everything's filed. Your solicitor is sharp. He's confident." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I was out here when you rode back in. I noticed. I heard you on the drive." A pause. "I can recognize your horse now, the way it moves." Clara looked out at the darkening land, at the fields she could see from here. The ones she had been walking twice a week now, checking, learning, forming a picture in her mind of what this estate could be when it was running the way it was built to run. "That's a useful skill," she said. "Most of what I've learned in 3 years has been useful," he said, reluctantly. She almost said something soft. She caught it, held it back, let it settle into a simpler thing. "You should have someone reliable to write your letters going forward. After the legal proceedings are done and things are stable, you should have an actual secretary, someone trained for it. I have you. You have me as an estate manager, which is a different thing and takes approximately all of my time." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Are you renegotiating the contract?" "I'm suggesting you're underutilizing your resources." "My resources," he repeated. He said it with a quality she couldn't quite identify, something between amusement and something quieter. "Is that what you are?" Clara turned her head and looked at him. He was facing forward toward the dark of the fields, his profile still in the cold air. 3 years ago, she thought this man had been the most formidable figure in the county. She could see it in the way he stood. Straight, held, a man accustomed to authority, even when authority had stopped coming naturally. He had not lost it. He had just put it somewhere he couldn't reach anymore. She was starting to understand that her job, the one she had not technically been hired for, the one she had taken on without being asked, was to hand it back to him piece by piece. "I'm your employee, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Currently your best one." "Currently my only qualified one," he said. "That too." They stood on the porch for another few minutes without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Clara had felt since she'd arrived. The kind that means two people have stopped performing normalcy and have arrived at it. Then the second letter came. She found it the following Monday, tucked among the regular post Ellis had left on the hall table, and she knew before she opened it who it was from. The handwriting on the outside was familiar in the specific dread-inducing way of something you recognize before your mind fully catches up to why. Her father. She read it standing in the hallway, not sitting, because she had a feeling sitting would make it worse. He was coming to visit, not asking, not requesting, informing. He would arrive on Saturday, he wrote, and he looked forward to seeing how she had settled in, and he hoped that she had spoken warmly of the family to Mr. Whitmore, and he was sure that given her position in the household, there would be opportunities to discuss. Here the language became vague in the practiced way of a man who was circling something he didn't want to name directly. Certain matters of mutual benefit. Clara folded the letter. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to find Nathaniel. I was in the study. She came in without knocking. They had stopped the formality of knocking about a week ago, by mutual unspoken agreement, and she set the letter on the desk and said, "My father is coming Saturday." Nathaniel's expression did not shift dramatically, but something in it changed very slightly in the way of a man recalibrating. "Did you invite him?" "No." "Did you write to him at all?" "Not once." He was quiet. "What does he want?" He doesn't say directly. He implies he'd like to discuss opportunities." She kept her voice even. "He wants something. I don't know what yet. But I know my father, and I know that voice in his writing, and he is coming here because he thinks my position in this house gives him some kind of leverage." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Does he know the terms of your contract?" "He knows you signed it. He doesn't know every clause." "He doesn't know the clause about earnings?" "No." "He's going to ask you for money." Clara had known this. She had known it since the second line of the letter. Hearing someone else say it plainly made it land differently, not worse, just more solid, real in a new way. "Probably." "And if you refuse?" She looked at him. "Then I refuse. He has no legal claim. He signed it away." "That won't stop him from trying." "No," she said. "It won't." Nathaniel turned his face toward the window, and she could see him thinking through something. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might leave the matter with her. It was her problem after all. Her family, and she had not asked for his intervention and had no expectation of it. Then he said, "When your father arrives on Saturday, I'd like to be present." Clara looked at him. "Not to speak for you," he said. "You can handle your own conversations, and I have observed this clearly. But I'd like to be present as the owner of this estate, so that your father is reminded precisely of what context he is walking into." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He turned back from the window. "I'd like to. There's a difference." Something moved in her chest. She pressed it flat before it could show in her face. "All right," she said. "Saturday." "Saturday," he said. And then, with the careful precision that she had come to understand was not coldness, but control. "And Miss Bennett, whatever your father says or implies when he arrives, you are not obligated to be his solution. Not anymore." Clara picked up the letter from his desk and folded it back into her pocket. "I know," she said. "I knew that before I came here." She had. She had known it on the 14-mile ride when her hands had tightened on the reins and her stomach had dropped. She had known it when she stood in the parlor and said $400 like it was a verdict. She had known it when she looked at the blind man across the desk and saw for one unguarded moment something that looked like recognition. What she had not known, what she was only beginning to understand now, standing in the study of a man who had just offered to stand beside her without being asked, was that knowing something and having someone else confirm it were two different things, and that the second one mattered more than she had expected. Saturday came gray and cold, the kind of November morning that feels like a warning. Thomas Bennett arrived at 10 o'clock in a borrowed wagon, dressed in his better coat, his hat cleaned. He had the look of a man who had been practicing a performance, not quite confident, but committed, the posture of someone who has decided a thing and is not yet sure if the decision will hold. Ellis showed him to the front parlor. Clara was already there. She was sitting in the straight-backed chair near the fireplace, not the settee she had chosen. The straight-backed chair deliberately, because it put her at eye level with a standing man, and because it was the kind of chair you sat in when you wanted to signal that this was not a comfortable social call. Her father came in and took her in the contract on her lap. The set of her shoulders, the stillness, and something in his rehearsed expression wobbled slightly. "Clara." He opened his arms slightly. She did not stand. "Papa." He dropped his arms, came and sat across from her. "You look well." "I am well. It's a fine house." "It is." He turned his hat in his hands. She watched him do it, the same gesture from the same man, and waited. She had learned a long time ago that with her father, the fastest route through a thing was to let him find his own way to it. "I've been worried about you," he said. "Being out here alone with a man you didn't know." "I'm not alone," Clara said. "There's a full household staff and a signed contract, and I am in no danger of any kind, which I think you were aware of before you came." His jaw moved. "I came to see my daughter." "You came because you need something." She said it without anger, just fact. "I'd rather we not spend time on the path to it. What do you need, Papa?" The hat went around twice. "The creditors, there's another debt. The south parcel, the one I was hoping to keep. They've called it due early, and I've got 60 days. Clara said nothing. "I thought you've got a wage now, a regular wage. And Mr. Whitmore, from what I understand, he's a wealthy man, and you've been useful to him, and perhaps you might speak to him on my behalf." "No," Clara said. Thomas blinked. "Clara." "No," she said again. "I won't ask Mr. Whitmore to pay your debts, and I won't give you my wages, and I won't use whatever goodwill I've built here to serve as a financial remedy for decisions you made before I arrived." Her voice was still even, still quiet. "The clause in my contract exists, Papa. You signed it. You have no claim to my earnings. I'm your father. You are. And you sold me to pay your debts, and I let you, and I have not asked you for an apology, and I'm not asking now. But I will not keep being the solution to problems you created." She leaned forward slightly. "I love you. You are my father, and I love you. But I cannot keep you afloat, and I will not try." Thomas Bennett's face did something complicated. Grief moved through it, and then the thing that follows grief, when a man is not quite ready to receive it, a hardening, a slight pull toward resentment. "After everything I did to Mr. Bennett." Thomas turned. Nathaniel Whitmore was in the doorway. How was dressed well. Clara had not known he was going to make that particular effort, and something about it caught her off guard. He stood in the doorway with the stillness of a man who did not need to see a room to command it, and he directed his voice toward the precise location of Thomas's chair, with an accuracy that would not have been possible 3 weeks ago. "Your daughter," Nathaniel said, "has been the most competent employee this estate has employed in 3 years. She has recovered documented funds from 2 instances of active theft, reformed the financial management of the property, and improved the conditions of every member of this household." A pause, each word landing flat and certain. "She has done this in 18 days. Thomas said nothing. "She is not a resource," Nathaniel continued. "She is not a remedy. She is a person who has chosen to do excellent work in a difficult situation, and she has earned every cent of her wage through that work." He stepped into the room, carefully, precisely stopping at exactly the right distance. "If you've come here looking for something she can provide at the expense of her own interests, I would encourage you to look elsewhere." Thomas's hat was no longer moving in his hands. He was holding it very still, the way you hold something when your hands need something to grip. "I'm speaking to my daughter," he said, and his voice had an edge. "And I'm speaking to a man on my property," Nathaniel said without matching the edge, which was Clara understood more effective than matching it, "who arrived uninvited." The parlor was very quiet. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. She did not fill the silence. Her father stood. He put on his hat. He was breathing harder than he'd come in, she could see it in his chest, the effort of a man who had braced for a negotiation and found a wall instead. "You've changed," he said to her, not kindly. "No," Clara said. "I haven't. You just didn't know me very well." He left. They heard the wagon on the drive, and then the gate, and then the sound of hooves fading down the road, and then nothing. Clara sat in the straight-backed chair with her contract on her lap and her hands very still, and she breathed. Nathaniel had not moved from his place in the room. He stood with his hands at his sides facing the direction her father had been, and Clara looked at him and thought about the fact that he had done that. He had said that. He had walked into a room on her behalf without being asked to do anything more than be present, and he had been more than present. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Miss Bennett." "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said." "I know you did." She stood, smoothed her dress. Every word of it. He turned his face toward her, not quite meeting her eyes. The way that was his specific way, the particular angle of someone navigating by sound and proximity. "Are you all right?" She thought about that. She thought about the 14 miles and the paper on the desk, and the way her father had touched her shoulder, like something being returned to a shelf. She thought about 18 days and the account books and the East Wing she hadn't described to him yet, and the morning he had laughed for the first time. "Yes," she said, and meant it with something that surprised her. "I think I actually am." Outside, the November fields stretched away from Whitmore Estate, still and waiting, and somewhere out there, Josiah and the others were working land that was being paid for honestly for the first time in 2 years. The house breathed around them. The fire settled in the parlor hearth. Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the room where Clara Bennett's father had just tried to take from her the last thing she had, and she had held it completely without flinching, without asking for rescue. He had not needed to say much at all. That was the thing neither of them said out loud, standing in that quiet parlor with the winter light coming through the windows and the estate humming around them with the first signs of something that had not been there before. Something that felt against all reasonable expectation, like returning. The letter from the solicitor arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. Clara had been expecting good news. The case against Harrison and Silas had been building for 3 weeks. Documentation, tight witnesses, confirmed the sheriff in Boyle County cooperative. She had filed every paper herself, cross-referenced every figure, built the case with the same careful, unhurried precision she brought to everything. She had been confident. She was not prepared for what the letter actually said. She read it twice at the hall table before she moved. Then she walked to the study, sat down in the chair across from Nathaniel and said, "There's a problem." He set down the surveying text Ellis had been reading aloud to him. "Tell me, Harrison isn't just a thief," she said. "He's been talking to people in town, to the right people, specifically the kind who have reasons of their own to want Whitmore Estate weakened." She put the letter on the desk. "Your solicitor says 3 of the county commissioners have been asking questions about the estate's solvency. They're claiming the mismanagement suggests you're no longer capable of maintaining the property. There's language being used." She stopped for a moment, choosing how to say the next part. "Language about your condition, your fitness to manage holdings of this size." The room was very still. "They're making a case," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I can't run this estate because I can't see. Harrison is feeding them information, not accurate information. He's been selective about what he shares and what he omits. He's showing them the accounts from the periods of worst mismanagement without the context of who is responsible for them." Clara's voice stayed even, but something underneath it had gone very tight. "To someone who doesn't know the full picture, it looks like the estate has been in freefall for 3 years under your watch. And now there's a 19-year-old girl managing it," Nathaniel said, "which they're also using." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Your solicitor heard from a county clerk that someone is calling me a convenient fixture, implying the arrangement is improper, that you hired me not for my competence but for—" She stopped. "Say it," he said. "Other reasons." She said it plainly. "They're suggesting the arrangement between us is not professional, and that a man who would enter into that kind of arrangement with a girl whose father traded her for a debt settlement is not a man who should be trusted with significant land holdings." The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that means the wound has reached somewhere deeper than the obvious. Nathaniel sat very still. His hands were on the armrests of his chair, and he was not gripping them, which cost him something she could see from across the desk. A man practicing control over a body that wanted to do something else entirely. Who is behind this? The solicitor names two men specifically, Aldous Crane and his brother-in-law, Judge Pruitt. She paused. Do you know them? Something moved across Nathaniel's face, something old and cold and recognizing. Crane has wanted the east parcel of this land for 15 years. My father refused him twice. I refused him once 2 years before the accident. He stopped. I haven't been in a position to refuse anyone anything for 3 years. He's been waiting. He found his opening, Clara said. He found his opening. Nathaniel stood. He moved to the window and stood there, not looking out, just standing near it, near the sensation of the cold coming through the glass, near something that was outside the walls of a house he had been hiding in for too long. What does my solicitor recommend? Public presence, Clara said. He's very direct about it in the letter. He says the only counter to the narrative Harrison is building is visibility. If you are seen at church, at the market, conducting estate business in public, the story of a ruined man who can't manage his own affairs becomes considerably harder to sell. Nathaniel said nothing. He also recommends, she continued, watching him carefully, that the nature of my employment be made explicitly clear in a public context, that I be introduced as your estate manager, formally, with that title in front of witnesses who will carry it back to town. So they can't keep calling you something else, he said. So it becomes the established fact instead of their version. He turned from the window, not toward her, toward the room, the general shape of where she was. And you, are you willing to do that? To be made publicly visible in that way, knowing what people are already saying? Clara thought about the 14 miles, about the paper on the desk, about the way Nathaniel had stood in the parlor doorway and said, she is not a resource to a man who had spent 19 years treating her as exactly that. I've been the subject of other people's conclusions my entire life. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I am not afraid of it. This will be worse than what you've experienced. I expect it will be. People in this county will be deliberately unkind. People in this county have been deliberately unkind to me since my father's farm started failing, she said. The only difference now is that I'll be standing next to someone worth standing next to. The silence after that was a different shape. Nathaniel stood in it for a long moment, and Clara watched something move through him, some internal negotiation. She was not privy to some conversation between the man he had been and the man 3 years of darkness had made him, and the man he was only now beginning to remember he could still be. Then he said, We'll go to church on Sunday. Clara exhaled. I'll tell Ellis. Tell Martha too. She'll want to press my coat. A pause. She's been waiting for me to go back out there for 2 years. Don't tell her that. She already knows, Clara said. He almost smiled. Of course she does. Sunday came with the particular cruelty of a beautiful morning, clear sky, cold sun. The kind of November day that feels like the world is showing off precisely when you would prefer it to be gray and unremarkable, so that no one has an excuse to be out. Every family in 3 miles of the Whitmore property would be at First Methodist. Clara had known this when Nathaniel made the decision, and she had not said so, and she was not going to say so now. She met him in the front hall at 9:30. He was dressed well better than she'd seen him, his coat pressed exactly as Martha had promised, his bearing the kind that came from muscle memory of a life before retreat. He stood straight. He looked like a man who owned land, which he did, and like a man who had not left his house in 8 months, which he also did, if you knew where to look. Clara knew where to look. She made sure nothing in her face showed it. Ready, she said. No, he said honestly. Let's go anyway. They took the wagon. Ellis drove. Clara sat beside Nathaniel, and they did not speak much on the road, and the silence between them by now had enough texture to it that its particular quality told her things. This one was braced, contained a man running through eventualities, the way you run through them when you can't see what's coming and have to be ready for everything at once. She said quietly, so Ellis wouldn't hear. If it gets bad, we leave. No performance required. It won't get bad, he said. I know, but if it does. He was quiet for a moment. If it gets bad, he said finally, I want you to tell me immediately. Don't manage it alone and don't protect me from it. Just tell me." "All right. I mean that," he said. "I have been managed and protected and kept in the dark literally and otherwise for 3 years. I don't want that from you. Of all the people in my life, I don't want that from you." Clara looked at his profile, the straight line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "You won't get it," she said. "I promise you that." They arrived at First Methodist at 9:45. Ellis tied the horse. Nathaniel stepped down from the wagon with Clara one step behind, and she offered her arm, not because he needed it. She had watched him navigate the estate grounds with increasing confidence for 3 weeks, but because this was unfamiliar ground, and because it was the natural thing, and because she had decided that treating him as someone who required constant accommodation and treating him as someone who deserved a normal human gesture were 2 different things, and she was committed to the second. He took her arm. They walked toward the church. The change in the air was immediate. She felt it the way a gathering of people changes its texture when it becomes aware of something. The conversations near the church steps didn't stop, but they broke apart into something more pointed. Heads turning. The specific silence that formed named Margaret Hale, whose husband Clara would learn later did business with Aldous Crane, stepped into their path. Not deliberately blocking it, but the pause was long enough to be intentional. She looked at Clara with the particular expression of a woman performing concern while delivering a verdict. "Miss Bennett," she said. "What a surprise to see you here." "Good morning, Mrs. Hale," Clara said. The woman's eyes moved to Nathaniel, then back to Clara, and what they did in that transit was not subtle. "And Mr. Whitmore. We hadn't expected it's been so long." "It has," Nathaniel said. His voice was completely level. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale." Margaret Hale's smile was the kind that belongs on a woman who is saying something without saying it. "You must be so grateful to have help, these days." Clara felt Nathaniel's arm shift slightly under her hand. A very small movement, barely perceptible, the kind that means something is being held down. She did not look at him. She said pleasantly to Margaret Hale, "Mr. Whitmore is fortunate to have a well-staffed estate. We all are. I understand the harvest was difficult for many families this year. It's a good season to have capable management in place." Something in Margaret Hale's smile went slightly fixed. "Yes, I suppose it is." They went inside. Nathaniel beside her said nothing until they were seated in a pew near the middle, not hidden in the back, not aggressive at the front, the middle deliberate and visible. Then so low that only she could hear, "Well done." "She was rude," Clara said. "Yes. I don't tolerate rude." "I've noticed," he said. And something in his voice was warm, which was different from the dry humor she'd come to know. Warmer than that. She did not examine it. She picked up the hymnal. The sermon was about perseverance. Clara suspected the pastor had chosen it specifically for this Sunday, which was either a kindness or a performance, and she decided to accept it as the former. She sang the hymns, and Nathaniel sat beside her and did not sing. She wondered if he had once been a man who sang in church and thought probably yes, and thought that was a thing worth reclaiming eventually. Not today. Today was enough. After the service, the interaction that Clara had been preparing for happened in the churchyard. Aldous Crane was exactly what she expected. A broad man in his 50s, well-dressed, the kind of physical presence that had spent decades being used as a substitute for actual authority. He approached them with the ease of someone who assumed the ground beneath him was always his. He had 2 other men with him, which told Clara the approach was not spontaneous. "Whitmore," he said. "No title. Not Mr. Whitmore, just Whitmore, the way you'd address a younger man or a diminished one." Nathaniel turned toward the voice with the precision Clara had been watching develop over 3 weeks. "Crane," he said in exactly the same register, not Mr. Crane either. Crane's eyes moved to Clara in the way a man's eyes move when he is deciding how to use a thing. "Your assistant." "My estate manager," Nathaniel said. "Miss Clara Bennett." "Yes." Crane smiled. It was not a warm smile. "We've been hearing about Miss Bennett. The whole county has, in fact." He paused, letting that land. "Quite an arrangement you've made." "An effective one," Nathaniel said. Crane looked at Clara directly now. "Your father is Thomas Bennett. The Bennett farm outside Harlan. That's right, Clara said. Struggled quite a bit from what I understand. Significant debts. Resolved, Clara said. As of 6 weeks ago. Something flickered in Crane's expression. She had answered too quickly and too precisely, and he'd wanted to draw that information out slowly, use it as a reveal. She hadn't let him. Yes, well. He turned back to Nathaniel. I've been meaning to come out to the estate. I have some concerns as someone who has a long history with your family about the direction things have been going. The account irregularities, the staff turnover. Those matters are in the hands of my solicitor, Nathaniel said. As you likely know, given your relationship with the men responsible for them. A pause. The two men behind Crane shifted slightly. I don't know what you're implying, Crane said. His voice had hardened under the social surface. I'm not implying anything, Nathaniel said. I'm observing that Harrison worked for you for 2 years before he worked for me, and that the accounting methods he used on my estate bear a notable resemblance to methods my solicitor has found in public records from that period. He said it quietly, conversationally, as though discussing the weather. My solicitor is a thorough man, Crane. He tends to follow things until they're fully resolved. The churchyard had gone notably quiet around them. These things traveled not what was said exactly, but the shape of what was said, the quality of the exchange, who walked away first. Crane's jaw tightened. You're making accusations. I'm making observations, Nathaniel said. The difference matters in court. The word court landed like a stone. Crane looked at Clara, and this look was different from the ones before. This one had something in it that was closer to what it actually was: assessment. Recalculation. He had come to this churchyard expecting a diminished man with a naive girl, and he had found something else entirely. You've been coaching him, he said to her. Low just for them. Mr. Whitmore doesn't require coaching, Clara said. He requires accurate information. That's my job. Crane looked between them for one more moment. Then he said to Nathaniel, This isn't finished, and turned and walked away, his two companions following with the particular speed of men who have witnessed something go wrong and want distance from it. Nathaniel stood with his hands clasped behind his back until the footsteps were gone. Then he exhaled, just once, controlled, barely visible. Are people watching? Yes, Clara said. How many? Most of the churchyard. Good, he said. Let them watch. She looked at him. At the set of his jaw, the straight line of his spine, the man who had not left his house in 8 months, standing in a churchyard in the November sun, after just quietly dismantling one of the most powerful men in the county. You knew about the Harrison connection to Crane, she said. Before today. My solicitor mentioned it last week. You didn't tell me. I was waiting for the right moment, he said. Crane coming to us in a public setting was considerably more useful than anything I could have arranged. A pause. I should have told you. I'm sorry. Clara stared at him. You planned this. I prepared for a possibility, he said. There's a difference. She thought about that for a moment. I thought you were afraid to come today. I was, he said simply. Both things can be true. They stood in the churchyard with the congregation moving around them in the specific way of people who are pretending not to pay attention while paying complete attention. And Clara looked at Nathaniel Whitmore and understood something that she had been approaching from the side for 3 weeks without letting herself look at it directly. He was not a man who had given up. He was a man who had been waiting for a reason not to. The ride back to Whitmore Estate was warmer than the ride out, which had nothing to do with the weather. Ellis drove with the particular contentment of a man who had heard the whole thing and was not going to say so. Clara sat beside Nathaniel, and they talked about Crane, about what the solicitor would need to know about the next steps, about the documentation that could be used if Crane decided to escalate. It was practical conversation. Tactical. The kind they had been having for 3 weeks. But underneath it, something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it, because naming it required acknowledging that the shift had happened, and they were both in their respective ways people who understood the value of letting a thing settle before you examined it. The twist arrived on Wednesday. Clara was in the study going through the final set of records, the ones from the period immediately after Nathaniel's accident, when the estate had been in the most chaotic transition and the financial irregularities were densest. She had been working through them systematically, page by page, the way she worked through everything, and she was 3 hours in when she found the entry that stopped her entirely. She sat with it for a long moment, read it again, a third time. Then she went to find Nathaniel. How was with Josiah in the horse barn? He had started going out to the stable in the mornings, which was one of the quiet, unannounced recoveries that Clara had been tracking without saying so. Josiah talked him through the condition of the animals with a patient directness that worked perfectly for a man who needed information without performance. She had once overheard them talking about a horse's temperament for 20 minutes with the ease of two men who had found a functional language. "I need to show you something," she said from the doorway. "When you have a moment." Josiah looked at her. Whatever was in her voice made him step back slightly. "I'll check the south stalls," he said, and was gone with the tact of a man who understood timing. Nathaniel turned toward her. "What is it?" "Come to the study." He heard it in her voice too, the quality that wasn't alarm exactly, but its composed cousin. He came. She put the ledger on the desk and read him the entry. Slowly, precisely, every number and every name. It was a land transfer document. Not a sale, a signed agreement predating the accident in which Nathaniel's previous solicitor, a man named Gideon Cole, not the current man, his predecessor had prepared paperwork transferring a significant portion of the Whitmore East parcel to a holding company. The signature on the document was Nathaniel's. The date was 3 months after the accident. "I didn't sign that," Nathaniel said. Clara had thought so. She had hoped so. "You're certain?" 3 months after the accident, I could not write my own name legibly. My hand coordination was severely affected for the first 8 months, nerve damage from the fall. His voice was very controlled. "I couldn't have produced that signature." "Then someone forged it." "Someone forged it," he said. "And the holding company." Clara had already checked. She had been checking since she found the entry the full hour before she came to find him. "It's registered to a man named Gideon Cole." The silence that followed was not the kind she was used to. This one was colder. This one had age in it. "How is my solicitor?" Nathaniel said. "He retired 2 years ago, said his health was failing. I gave him a settlement, a generous one. He'd served the family for 30 years. A pause. "Crane and Cole were friends. I knew that. I never thought—" "The transfer was never completed," Clara said. "That's the thing, Mr. Whitmore. The paperwork is here, but the legal execution isn't. Something stopped it. Maybe Cole got nervous. Maybe the process stalled. But the document exists, and the signature on it is forged. And if Crane is connected to this holding company, which I believe he is, then what happened on that estate isn't just Harrison and Silas stealing wages and supply money." She let that breathe for 1 second. "Someone tried to take your land." Nathaniel stood completely still. "The East parcel," he said. "Yes." "The parcel he's been trying to buy for 15 years. "Yes." While I couldn't." He stopped. Clara gave him the moment. She did not rush it or fill it or try to manage it. She simply stood there while he absorbed what it meant that the 3 years he had spent in grief and retreat, the 3 years he had blamed on his own incapacity, had also been 3 years in which people who knew him had circled his vulnerability like men who had been waiting for exactly this. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not louder, quieter, which was worse. The quiet of something that has found its direction. "Get my solicitor on paper today. Not a letter, I want him here, at the estate, by Friday. I'll send a writer this afternoon. And the forged document, I want it secured, locked separate from the other records." "Already done," she said. He stopped. "Already done. When I found it, I made a copy and locked the original in the desk drawer. The key is here." She set it on the desk between them. He reached for it, found it, closed his hand around it. "You found this an hour ago." "Approximately." "And in that hour you copied it secured. It verified the holding company registration and connected Cole to Crane." "I work quickly when it matters." A pause. "Miss Bennett?" Mr. Whitmore. He set the key down and looked toward her. The particular way that was his, that she had stopped interpreting as approximation, and had started understanding as intention, because when Nathaniel Whitmore turned his face toward her, there was nothing approximate about the attention behind it. "I owe you a great deal more than a wage. You owe me exactly what the contract says," she said, "which I set deliberately and which I'm satisfied with." She picked up the ledger. "But I will accept the acknowledgement." He almost smiled. "Almost." "Acknowledged," he said, unreservedly. She turned to go. She had the copy to put with the other documents the writer to send a dozen things that needed doing and needed doing today. "Clara." She stopped. He had never used her first name before, not once in 3 weeks. She turned back. I was still looking toward the place where she was standing. The key in his hand, the ledger on the desk between them. "Be careful," he said. "With Crane, with all of this. These are men who have been willing to forge documents and suborn theft. They are not—" a pause. "They are not people who will respond reasonably to being cornered." She understood what he was saying. Underneath the tactical concern was something else. Something that was not the voice of an employer to an employee, that was something older and simpler and more human than that. She stood with it for the moment. "I know," she said. "I'll be careful. I mean it." "So do I." She met his face, his attention, his direction, the way he was holding toward her. "Both of us will be." The writer went out that afternoon. By Thursday evening, word had come back that the solicitor would arrive Friday morning, and Clara spent Thursday night in the study, going through every remaining document she hadn't touched yet, looking for anything else, because if there was one forged transfer, there could be another, and she was not going to be surprised again. She found 2 more, not completed, not executed. Preparatory paperwork, the kind that gets drawn up before the final signatures. The kind that means someone had been planning this systematically and for longer than anyone had suspected. 3 different parcels, 3 different draft agreements, all bearing the same forged signature, all predating Cole's retirement by varying amounts. She sat back from the desk and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Then she picked up her pen and made 3 more careful copies, locked 3 more originals, and kept going. Nathaniel found her there in the morning. He came to the study doorway at 6 o'clock and stopped. "You didn't sleep." "I found more documents." A pause. He came fully into the room, sat in his chair. "How many?" 3 additional drafts. Same pattern, different parcels. She looked at him. He looked tired in a different way than usual. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but the tiredness of a man who had slept badly, because what he was carrying was heavy. How much of this estate would have been gone? He was quiet for a moment. "Most of it," he said. "The 3 parcels together with the east section, that's most of the productive land. They were going to take almost everything. They were going to take everything that mattered," he said. "Leave the house and a few acres and let me sit in it thinking I had failed entirely on my own." Clara looked at the documents in front of her. The careful handwriting of a forged signature. The dates. The names. The years of planning behind it. The cold patience of men who had looked at another man's devastation and seen an opportunity. "Your solicitor needs to see all of this today." "He will." Nathaniel put his hands flat on the desk. "Clara, what you've done in the past week specifically and the past month generally is going to save this estate." "We're going to save this estate," she said. "There's a difference." He looked toward her. The early light was coming through the window behind his chair, and it caught the side of his face, and Clara was aware, not for the first time but more fully than before, that this was a man who had come back from somewhere very far away and was still coming back, and that she had been part of how that happened. She was not sure what to do with that knowledge. She filed it alongside the other things she was not yet examining directly and picked up the solicitor's file. "He arrives at 9, she said. "I'll have everything organized before then." "I know you will," Nathaniel said, "and that I know you will deliver without question or qualification, with the simple certainty of a man who had stopped doubting the person across from him, settled into Clara Bennett's chest, and stayed there warm and inconvenient and entirely real. She kept her eyes on the documents, but she did not try to make it go away. The solicitor's name was Edmund Hart, and he arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, which told Clara something useful about him before he said a word. A man who arrives exactly on time is a man who respects other people's hours. A man who respects other people's hours is a man who takes his work seriously. She had chosen him from Nathaniel's correspondence files 3 weeks ago, based on the precision of his letters, and standing in the front hall, watching him hand his coat to Ellis, she felt the particular satisfaction of a judgment confirmed. How was 60 thin, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent 40 years reading documents for what they concealed rather than what they stated. He looked at Clara and said, "Miss Bennett, your letters have been the most organized I've received in 20 years of practice." "Thank you," she said. "We have a great deal to show you." "So your last letter suggested." He looked around the hall with professional assessment. "Where is Mr. Whitmore?" "Study," Nathaniel said from the doorway. Hart looked at him. Something moved in the solicitor's expression, not pity, which Clara had been afraid of, but something closer to relief. The relief of a man who had been corresponding with an estate in crisis for weeks and had not been entirely certain what he would find when he arrived. What he found was Nathaniel Whitmore standing straight in his own doorway, present and focused and clearly in command of whatever room he was standing in. "Mr. Whitmore," Hart said. "It's good to see you, sir." "Come in," Nathaniel said. "We have work to do." They spent 4 hours in the study. Clara had the documents laid out in the order she'd prepared. Harrison's fraud first, Silas second, then Cole's forged transfers in chronological sequence, then the holding company registration, then the thread connecting Cole to Crane. She had written a summary document 2 pages precise and sourceable, every claim tied to a specific record. Hart read everything without speaking. This took a long time, and neither Clara nor Nathaniel rushed him, which was the right instinct. When he finished the summary document, he set it down and was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man arranging a very large and serious thing in his mind. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, "how old are you?" 19, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Then he looked back at the documents. "Right," he said. "Here is where we are." He walked them through it methodically. Harrison and Silas, straightforward criminal theft, strong case, likely recovery of most of the funds with interest if they moved quickly. Cole's forgeries more complex because Cole was elderly and would claim infirmity, and because proving a forged signature required expert testimony that would take time to arrange. Crane's connection to the holding company present in the documents, but requiring additional evidence to constitute a direct legal claim. "We can take Harrison and Silas to judgment in 6 weeks, Hart said. "Cole will take longer, 3 to 4 months, possibly more. Crane," he paused. "Crane is connected but not exposed. Not yet. If he's aware we have these documents, he'll move quickly to distance himself from the holding company." "He's already aware we found something," Nathaniel said. "The church on Sunday." "What happened Sunday?" Clara told him. Hart listened with his hands folded and his expression attentive and increasingly sharp. When she finished, he said, "He came to you, publicly." "Yes." "And you mentioned the solicitor and the court." "Mr. Whitmore did." Hart looked at Nathaniel. "That was well done." "It flushed him," Nathaniel said. "If he was uncertain before whether we had anything connecting him, he isn't uncertain now. He knows we're looking." "Which means he'll act," Hart said. "Quickly." "What kind of action?" Clara asked. Hart picked up the forged transfer document. "He'll try to legitimize this. If he can get a second signature on this paperwork, a real one obtained under some kind of pressure or false pretense, the forgery becomes much harder to prove. The document goes from a crime to a disputed contract." He set it back down. "Is there anyone who has access to Mr. Whitmore who Crane could use? Anyone whose loyalty might be questionable?" Clara thought of every person currently employed on the estate. She went through them methodically. Martha, Josiah, the 2 other farmhands, the stable boy. "No," she said. "Not on the estate." "Outside it," Hart said. "Family. Social connections." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I have a cousin, Robert Whitmore. He's been peripheral. We haven't been close since the accident. Is he in contact with Crane? I don't know. Find out, Hart said. Not unkindly, but directly. Today if possible. The name Robert Whitmore had come up once before, in a letter Clara had found in the estate correspondence files written 8 months after the accident from Robert to Nathaniel. She had read it the same way she read everything, and she had filed it, and she had said nothing because it had not seemed immediately relevant. Now she thought about that letter, thought about its specific contents, thought about the careful, solicitous quality of its language, the way it had expressed concern for Nathaniel's well-being, while also asking quite naturally, quite reasonably sounding, about the state of the estate's finances. She thought about the date on that letter. And then she thought about the date on the earliest of Cole's draft documents. They were 6 weeks apart. She did not say this yet. She needed to be certain before she said it. But she felt it click into place with the quiet, specific precision of a key, finding a lock it was always meant for. I'll reach out to Robert this week, Nathaniel was saying to Hart. Carefully. Don't signal anything, Hart said. Social if possible, familial. You haven't spoken in months, a simple reaching out to reconnect won't raise. I'll write the letter, Clara said. Both men looked at her. I know his correspondence style from the files, she said to Nathaniel. I know what registers naturally between you. If you tell me what you want to convey, I can draft something that sounds like you and prompts the kind of response that would tell us what we need to know. She paused. And if Robert has been in contact with Crane, a letter that sounds ordinary will be more revealing than one that sounds like an investigation. Hart looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to Nathaniel, Keep her. She's not going anywhere, Nathaniel said. Clara picked up her pen. What would you like to say to your cousin? The letter went out that afternoon. Clara had written it 3 times before she was satisfied the first version too formal, the second too warm, the third landing exactly in the register of a man who had been isolated and was tentatively reaching back toward family connection. She read it aloud to Nathaniel twice before it was sealed, and both times he said, Yes, that's right. The second time he said it with a quality she had started to recognize, the particular certainty of a man who has stopped being surprised by her and has moved to something past surprise. She sealed it and sent it with the afternoon rider. Then she went back to the documents because there was still the matter of what she had noticed about the dates and had not yet said. She found Nathaniel after supper. He was on the porch again. The habit had developed slowly, the porch in the evenings, which was progress of such obvious significance that she and Ellis had discussed it exactly once quietly and agreed not to mention it to Nathaniel directly. She stood beside him and said without preamble, I need to tell you something about Robert. He was still. Tell me. His letter to you, the one from 8 months after the accident. It's in the correspondence files. I remember it. He asked about the estate finances, specifically about the land holdings, the parcels, the approximate acreage, the current valuations. She paused. The first of Cole's draft transfer documents is dated 6 weeks after that letter. The porch was cold and quiet. The night sounds of the estate moved around them. Somewhere across the property, a horse shifted in the stable. Nathaniel stood very still. You think Robert told Cole, he said, what to go after. I think someone gave Cole specific information about which parcels were most valuable and most vulnerable. The draft documents don't go after the less productive land. They go after the exact acreage that represents the most agricultural and mineral value. She kept her voice even. That kind of specificity doesn't come from a general familiarity with the estate. It comes from someone who knew exactly what was worth taking. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. Not softer, but quieter, the way something goes when it has been struck at a depth below the ordinary. He came to see me, once about a year after the accident. I wasn't receiving visitors then. I had Ellis turn him away. Did he try again? No. He wrote that one letter. Yes. And then nothing, Clara said. Until now. Until now. Nathaniel agreed. She let the silence breathe. Then, he may not have known what Cole intended to do with the information. It's possible he was simply talking. sharing family concerns with someone he trusted without understanding the purpose behind the questions being asked. That's a generous interpretation. It's a possible one. I don't know which it is yet. She turned toward him. That's why the letter needed to be written carefully. If Robert is innocent, he'll respond warmly and openly. If he's been part of this, the response will tell us. People who have something to hide write very differently than people who don't. Nathaniel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, facing the dark of the land he had nearly lost without knowing it. And Clara stood beside him in the cold and waited while he worked through something that was not a legal problem or a financial problem, but the specific terrible human problem of wondering whether someone you loved had watched you fall and chosen to profit from it. I believed he was grieving with me, Nathaniel said finally. After the accident, I thought... He stopped. I thought the people in my life who stayed silent were staying silent because they didn't know what to say. It didn't occur to me that some of them were staying silent because they were waiting. Clara said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. My father built this estate, he said. 30 years, every acre of it deliberate. He used to walk the boundary lines with me when I was a boy every summer, the whole perimeter. He wanted me to know where it started and where it ended. He said a man who doesn't know his own land doesn't know himself. His voice was steady, but what was underneath it was not. I spent 3 years not walking any of it. I told myself it was because I couldn't. But I think part of it was, you didn't want to feel it, Clara said quietly. What you thought you'd lost. Yes. You hadn't lost it. I know that now. You were never going to lose it, she said. Not because of your eyes. The only way this land was leaving Whitmore hands was if someone took it while you weren't looking. She paused. And you're looking now. He turned his face toward her. The night was very dark, and the porch light was low, and she could see him clearly anyway, because she had learned him by now, learned the way his expression moved when he was thinking versus when he was feeling learned. The difference between his controlled voice and his real one, learned all the things a person learns about another person when they have been paying close attention for 7 weeks. Clara, he said. Mr. Whitmore, I think you should know. He stopped, started again. I am aware that the circumstances that brought you here were unjust. What your father did was wrong, and what I allowed in my first correspondence with him was wrong, and you have never once made me feel that debt less than I should. He was choosing his words carefully, more carefully than usual, which was already careful. But I want you to know that I am grateful, not for the accounts, and not for the documents, and not for Crane at the churchyard. He stopped. For the rest of it, the things that weren't in the contract. Clara was very still. The account books by touch, he said. The east wing, the porch. A pause. The way you speak to me, as though I am the same man I was before. She held that. All of it. Let it be the weight it was. You are the same man, she said. Somewhat improved, I'd argue. I'd argue that's your influence. I'd argue it was always there. He almost said something else. She could see it, the approach and the pulling back the thing at the edge of his expression that was not quite ready to be said. She did not press it. She had learned also the value of letting things come at their own pace with this man. Good night, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Good night, Miss Bennett. She went inside. She did not look back. But she stood in the front hall for a moment, one hand on the doorframe, and breathed. Robert's letter arrived on Saturday. Clara recognized the handwriting on the outside before Ellis finished carrying it to the hall table, and she took it without opening it, went to the study and closed the door. She read it alone first. She needed to. Because she had written that careful letter, had calibrated every word to draw out a true response, and she needed to know what the response was before she took it to Nathaniel. She needed to know what she was handing him. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a moment, looking at the wall. Then she went to find Nathaniel. I was with Josiah in the barn. She waited in the doorway until Josiah saw her expression and found somewhere else to be, and then she said, Robert wrote back. Nathaniel turned. Already? Saturday Post. He must have written the same day he received ours. She came in. Do you want me to read it to you? Yes. She read it. All of it. Robert's letter was warmly written, which was its own piece of information. It expressed gladness that Nathaniel had reached out. It asked about the estate, about his health, about the new management arrangement he had evidently heard about, because, and this was where Clara's voice stayed absolutely even, because Aldous Crane had mentioned it at a dinner the previous month, and Robert had been meaning to write ever since, but hadn't found the words. She finished the letter and waited. He had dinner with Crane, Nathaniel said, last month, which is approximately 2 weeks before Crane approached the county commissioners about your fitness to manage the estate. Robert knew what Crane was planning. That letter is written by a man who does not know he has given something away, Clara said carefully. He mentions Crane casually as a mutual acquaintance. He does not seem to understand that mentioning Crane at all in response to the letter I wrote is the most significant thing he could have done. He's not part of it deliberately. I don't think so. I think he's been managed by Crane the same way your estate was managed by Harrison and Silas used without fully understanding the purpose. She folded the letter, which makes him dangerous in a different way. A deliberate conspirator is predictable. An unwitting one isn't. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, can he be turned? Clara looked at him. What do you mean? Robert, if he understood what Crane has been doing, what Cole was doing, if he knew the full picture. A pause. He's not a bad man, Clara. He's a weak one. There's a difference. It was the second time he had used her first name. She noted it the same way she noted everything, filed it, let it be what it was. You want to tell him? I want to show him, Nathaniel said. I want him here, in this house with the documents in front of him. I want him to see, to understand that while he was having dinner with Aldous Crane, Crane was trying to take his family's land using a forged signature of mine. His voice had hardened in the particular way it did when something was no longer a legal problem and had become a personal one. Let him make his choice with full information. That's all I'll give him. But I'll give him that. Clara thought about it. The risk a man who was connected to Crane, who had been sharing information, however unwittingly, sitting in this house with knowledge of exactly what they had found. The risk was real. If he tells Crane what we've shown him, then he's made his choice, Nathaniel said. And we'll know who he is. And Hart will be ready. He turned toward her. I know it's a risk. Tell me if you think it's the wrong one. She thought about it honestly. Thought about Robert's letter. The warmth that didn't read as performance, the Crane reference dropped without apparent awareness of its weight, the genuine seeming gladness at being contacted. A man who was deliberately conspiring would have been more careful. A man who was unwitting would write exactly this way. Write him back, she said. Invite him to the estate, next week if he can manage it. She paused. And tell him to come alone. The look on Nathaniel's face when she said that was the closest thing to relief she had seen from him that didn't involve a problem being solved. This was something else, the relief of a man who had expected to be talked out of something and had not been. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when we know how it lands. Robert Whitmore arrived on Thursday, and he was not what Clara had expected. She had been picturing without meaning to something in Crane's image. A man of angles and calculation performance, dressed as warmth. What arrived was a man who was 40 years old and looked uncomfortable in his own skin, in the specific way of someone who has been making decisions he doesn't fully believe in and is beginning to feel the weight of them. He came into the study and stopped when he saw Nathaniel. Something crossed his face, surprise, and underneath surprise, something that looked like shame, which was either real or the most sophisticated piece of performance Clara had ever witnessed. Nat, he said. Robert. Nathaniel was seated at the desk, composed. Thank you for coming. Yes, of course. Robert looked around the study at the organized files, the documents, Clara sitting in her chair with her pen. You look... He stopped. Better than you expected, Nathaniel said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Robert said honestly. Yes, frankly. Sit down. Robert sat. He looked at Clara again. You must be Miss Bennett. I am, she said. Your letters are they're well written. Thank you. He looked between them with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the ground beneath this conversation is not what he thought it was. "What is this about, Nat? The letter said you wanted to talk, but it didn't. What's going on?" Nathaniel said, "I'm going to show you some documents. Clara will read them to you. And when she's finished, I want you to tell me everything you know about Aldous Crane." Robert was still for a moment. "Crane? What does Crane have to do with—" "Everything," Nathaniel said, "as it turns out." Clara began to read. She read the Harrison documents first because they were straightforward and established the pattern without touching anything personal. She watched Robert's as she read. He was genuinely surprised by Harrison. She could see it, the unwilled expression of someone receiving information they didn't have. She moved to Silas. Same reaction, different shade. She moved to Cole. Robert's face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way a man changes when he's caught. More like the way a man changes when something he suspected or feared or half knew at the edges of his thinking becomes fully visible. Like something coming into focus. She read the forged transfer documents. She read Cole's name. She read the dates. When she finished, the study was silent. "Cole told me," Robert said. His voice was rough. 2 years ago, before he retired, he said Nathaniel was struggling, that the estate was likely to fail, that it might be better for the family if the land was consolidated under someone who could manage it properly. He said Crane was prepared to offer fair market value and that it would be the responsible thing. He stopped. "I didn't know there was a forged document. I didn't know I thought he was talking about a legitimate sale. And you told him which parcels were most valuable," Nathaniel said. Robert closed his eyes. "He asked me. He said he wanted to make sure any offer was fair, that he didn't want to undervalue." He stopped, opened his eyes. "God, Nat, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Nathaniel said. "That's why you're here and not in front of a judge." Robert looked at him for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" Clara set down the last document. "Everything you know about Crane's relationship with Cole. Every conversation, every dinner, every letter you're aware of. Dates if you have them. We need to build the connection that the documents imply but don't fully prove." She paused. "And if there's anything else Cole said to you, anything that seemed peripheral at the time, we need that too." "I have letters," Robert said. "From Cole. I kept them because—" He shook his head. "I don't know why I kept them. Habit. I didn't think they mattered." Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, "Robert." "Yes. Those letters matter." "I know that now. Bring them. Everything you have. Come back Monday." Robert looked at his cousin, at the man sitting across from him, who had spent 3 years in a house people assumed was a kind of tomb, who had apparently spent that time being rebuilt from the inside by a 19-year-old with a pen and a very precise sense of justice. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the dinner with Crane. For the conversation with Cole. For not pushing harder when Ellis said you weren't receiving visitors. I should have—" "You should have," Nathaniel agreed. "But you're here now. That counts for something." He paused. "That's what Josiah told me when I started paying the men properly. I thought it was simple, but I've been thinking about it since. You're still here. That ought to count for something." Robert was quiet. Clara watched him decide something. She could see it happening, the internal settlement of a man who has been leaning one way for too long and is making the choice to lean the other. "Monday," Robert said. "I'll bring everything I have." He left an hour later, and Clara and Nathaniel sat in the study in the particular silence of a plan that has just revealed its next shape. "He'll bring the letters," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Clara said. "He will." "You're certain?" "He wrote to you the same day you wrote to him," she said. "He's been waiting for a reason to come back. People who are waiting for a reason don't need much of one." Nathaniel sat back. He looked tired, the good kind. She had started to distinguish the tiredness that comes from doing something real rather than from enduring something impossible. "Hart needs to know. I'll write to him tonight. And the documents need to be ready for Monday, everything organized, so Robert can see where his letters fit. I'll have it done. Clara." He stopped. She waited. When this is finished, when Crane is dealt with and the legal proceedings are complete and everything is settled. He paused. I want to renegotiate your contract. She looked at him. Oh, the current terms are appropriate for an estate manager, he said. They are not appropriate for the person who saved this estate. I want the title to reflect what you actually do, and the wage to reflect it. He was looking toward her, that particular directed attention. And I want to add a clause. What kind of clause? One that makes clear that this is your home, he said. Not a position, not an arrangement. Your home. For as long as you want it. The fire was low in the study hearth. The November dark pressed against the window. Clara sat with her pen in her hand and looked at the man across the desk and felt something settle in her chest that was not the satisfaction of a problem solved or a document correctly filed. Something larger and quieter and considerably more complicated. That's a significant clause, she said. I know what it is, he said. I'll need to think about it. Take the time you need, he said. That offer, unlike your father's, is entirely without condition or deadline. It will be there when you're ready. Clara looked down at her pen, at the documents on the desk, at the careful organized evidence of 7 weeks of work that had started with a paper slammed onto a desk and a man who tore it in half. I'll think about it, she said again, and meant it differently than the first time. Outside, the Kentucky night was deep and cold, and somewhere across the dark fields, Josiah was locking up the stable, and Martha was banking the kitchen fire, and Ellis was making his last slow round of the downstairs rooms with the lamp he'd carried for 30 years, and Whitmore Estate breathed around all of them solid and warming, and more alive than it had been in 3 years. And in the study, 2 people sat on either side of a desk covered in documents that were going to bring down a corrupt man, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was the fullest, warmest silence that house had held in a very long time. Robert came back on Monday with a leather satchel and the expression of a man who had not slept well in 3 days. Clara met him at the door before Ellis could. She looked at the satchel and said, All of it. Everything Cole ever sent me, Robert said. 14 letters. Some of them go back 6 years. 6 years. Clara kept her face neutral. Come in. Nathaniel was already in the study. He heard Robert's footsteps and said without looking up from the position Clara had learned meant he was thinking rather than waiting. You kept them in order. By date, Robert said. He was methodical. I didn't understand at the time that the methodology was the point. Give them to Clara. Robert handed her the satchel. She opened it at the desk and began reading immediately because there was no point in ceremony when there was work to do. The first letter was dated 6 years ago and was largely social Cole checking in with a peripheral family member. The kind of correspondence that establishes connection before it requests anything. She recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it in Harrison's earliest entries in Silas's first months on the estate. The long, patient construction of trust before the extraction began. He spent 2 years just writing to you, she said without looking up. We had dinner twice, Robert said. He seemed he was my father's solicitor before he was Nathaniel's. I thought of him as family almost. That's what he wanted you to think. She read through the letters in sequence, pulling dates and specific language cross-referencing with the timeline she had already built from the estate documents. The picture that emerged was more deliberate and more cold-blooded than even she had anticipated. Cole had been planning this not for 2 years, not for 3, but for the better part of a decade. The approach to Robert had begun before the accident. The accident had simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. She set down the 8th letter and said, He asked you about your uncle's will. Robert flinched. Yes. 3 years before the accident. I didn't think anything of it. It seemed like an old man's professional curiosity. He'd administered the estate for so long. I was looking for vulnerabilities in the inheritance structure, Clara said. If there had been a contested will or a secondary claim, the forgery would have been even easier to execute. She looked at Nathaniel. This goes deeper than we thought. Nathaniel had been listening with the complete focused stillness that she had come to understand was his most serious mode of attention. How deep? Cole wasn't working for Crane, she said. Not primarily, or not originally. She picked up the 11th letter, the one dated 4 months after the accident. He was working for himself. Crane came later. Cole had already begun the forgery process before Crane was involved, and then he brought Crane in because he needed the political protection. Crane's connection to Judge Pruitt, the commissioners. She set the letter down. Cole was the architect. Crane was the insurance. The study was very quiet. Which means, Nathaniel said slowly, that Cole has more exposure than we thought. Significantly more. And it means the forgery wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. She looked at Robert. Did Cole ever mention anyone else? Anyone beyond Crane? Robert thought for a moment. Then something moved across his face, the particular expression of a memory, arriving that he had not known was relevant until this moment. There was a man. He mentioned him once in passing. A land surveyor. I didn't know him. Cole said he was a professional associate. Name, Clara said. Marsh, I think. Daniel Marsh. Clara wrote it down. I'll find him. You don't know that he's involved. No, she said. But Cole didn't mention professional associates in passing. Everything that man said had a purpose. She capped the ink. Hart needs these letters today. Can I send a writer with copies? Whatever you need, Nathaniel said. She spent the next 2 hours copying the most significant letters by hand. The 3 that most directly implicated Cole's planning. The 2 that connected Crane, the one mentioning Marsh. Her hand ached by the end of it. She sent the writer to Lexington at noon. Then she went back to the study and said to Nathaniel, I need to go into town. He looked up. Why? Land surveyor records are public. If Daniel Marsh filed surveys on Whitmore land in the past 6 years without your authorization, it'll be in the county records. And if it's in the county records, I can get a copy. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. Precisely the same words he had used about her father's visit about the church on Sunday. She had started to understand that when Nathaniel Whitmore said, I know I don't have to, it meant the decision was made, and he was simply declining to debate it. Give me 10 minutes. They rode into Harlan in the early afternoon. Nathaniel, Clara, and Josiah, who had taken on the informal role of accompanying them on town errands, with the quiet, large-bodied presence of a man who understood that presence itself was sometimes the whole job. The county records office was on the main street, a squat building that smelled of old paper and damp wood, staffed by a clerk named Petty, who looked at Nathaniel Whitmore walking through his door and could not entirely conceal his surprise. Clara stepped forward before the clerk could compose whatever expression he was working on. We need to see land survey records. Whitmore property, Harlan County, the past 8 years. Petty looked at Nathaniel, at Clara, at Josiah standing in the doorway. Those records are public, he said carefully. Good, Clara said. Then we'd like to see them. It took 20 minutes for Petty to produce the relevant files, during which time Nathaniel stood near the window and Clara stood near the desk, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say yet. When the files arrived, she went through them quickly. She had developed a speed in the past 2 months that had started to feel like a second language, the language of documents and what they contained and what they were hiding. She found the Marsh surveys in the 4th file, 3 of them, filed over 4 years, each one covering a different section of Whitmore land. Each one commissioned by, and here was the thing that made her stop completely, a company called Bennett Agricultural Holdings. She stood with that for a moment. Bennett. Her own name. She read it again. 3 times. The company name did not change. She checked the registration date 7 years ago, well before her father's financial troubles had become acute. She checked the registered agent, Gideon Cole. She closed the file. She turned to Nathaniel and said quietly enough that Petty couldn't hear, They used my family name. He went still. What? The company that commissioned the surveys. It's called Bennett Agricultural Holdings, registered by Cole. No connection to my family. My father never knew it existed. She kept her voice level. They created a shell company using a common name, one that wouldn't raise suspicion in this county, because Bennett is an ordinary name here. But if the forged transfers had gone through and someone had started asking questions about who commissioned the preliminary surveys, it would have pointed to your family, Nathaniel said. His voice had gone very cold. Not to Cole, not to Crane. Yes. They built a misdirection into the plan. He was quiet for one moment. 1. They were going to frame your family, or simply muddy the water enough that any investigation stalled. She folded her hands. It doesn't change the case. The documents still point to Cole and to Crane, but it tells us how thoroughly this was constructed. She paused. And it tells me why my father's financial situation became as catastrophic as it did, as quickly as it did. Nathaniel turned toward her sharply. Explain that. Someone bought his debt, she said. His primary creditor, the man who called the notes due early and forced the situation that brought me here. I never looked into who that creditor sold to because it didn't seem relevant. She looked at Petty, who was very carefully organizing files on the other side of the room. I think if I look, I'm going to find Crane's name, or Cole's, or this company's. The silence between them was the kind that has a shape. They manufactured the debt crisis, Nathaniel said, to get you here. To get a Bennett name associated with this estate, she said. Whether that was me specifically or the name in general, I'm not certain. But yes. She picked up the file. I'd like to make copies of these, please, she said to Petty, who came over immediately. On the ride back to Whitmore Estate, nobody spoke for a long time. Josiah drove with his eyes on the road. Clara sat beside Nathaniel and felt the cold working through her coat, and thought about the shape of what they had uncovered, the full, long architecture of it, the years of planning, the patience required to build something this elaborate. She thought about her father riding through the gate of Whitmore Estate, with his hat in his hands, believing he had run out of options. She thought about the paper slammed on the desk. She thought about 19 years old and $400, and a man who tore the paper in half. He didn't do it to himself, she said finally. Nathaniel, who had been thinking in the particular way that required no sound, said, your father. He thought he failed. He thought he made bad choices and ran his farm into the ground through his own incapacity. She kept her eyes forward. Someone was pulling the debt. Someone was tightening the noose deliberately. She stopped. He made choices I don't forgive, but he was also being managed. Like your estate was being managed. Like Robert was being managed. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. Then, are you going to tell him? When this is over, she said. When there's something definitive to tell. She paused. He still doesn't get my wages. No, Nathaniel said. He doesn't. Something in his voice made Josiah on the driver's bench develop a sudden intense interest in the road ahead. Clara did not examine the something. She looked at the fields they were passing. Whitmore, she recognized it, now knew the fence lines and the acreage and the yield estimates, knew this land the way she had come to know the house. When Hart gets Robert's letters and the survey records, she said, how long before he can move on Crane? He'll need the Marsh connection confirmed, Nathaniel said, and he'll want the debt purchase verified, a week, perhaps 2. And then, Nathaniel said, Aldous Crane will be facing criminal charges for conspiracy to defraud, suborning, forgery, and whatever the appropriate charge is for deliberately engineering a man's financial ruin to facilitate a land seizure. Judge Pruitt will try to block it. Hart anticipated that. He's been in contact with the circuit court in Lexington. Pruitt's jurisdiction won't reach. A pause. He's been thorough. You hired a thorough man. I had a thorough woman review my correspondence and select him, Nathaniel said. There's a difference. Josiah made a sound that was almost certainly a cough. The confirmation of the debt purchase came from Hart 6 days later. He had found it in 3 hours, he wrote, which suggested he had known where to look because he had been thinking about it since their last meeting. Crane, through a financial intermediary, had purchased Thomas Bennett's primary debt 14 months ago, 8 months before Clara had arrived at Whitmore Estate. The timing aligned with Cole's retirement and the apparent stalling of the forged transfer process. When the direct approach had stalled, they had tried a different angle. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table, which was where she read things she needed to process before she presented them. Because Martha's kitchen had the specific quality of a place where difficult information became manageable. Martha herself was rolling pastry at the other end of the table, and did not ask questions, which was one of the many things Clara had come to appreciate about her. They needed someone inside the house, Clara said to the letter to Martha to the kitchen at large. Martha rolled the pastry. Seems like. Someone who would have access to the records, someone who could be positioned near Mr. Whitmore without raising suspicion. She set the letter down. They thought I would be grateful, pliable. A girl whose father had sold her would be so relieved to have a roof that she wouldn't look too carefully at what she was looking at. They didn't know you, Martha said. No, Clara said. They didn't. Martha looked at her. It was a brief look, the kind from a woman who does not waste expressions. He's a good man, Mr. Whitmore. I know that. Known it since before you came. Good man who lost his way for a while. She turned back to the pastry. Found it again. Clara picked up the letter. I'm going to tell him about this. Course you are, Martha said, as though there had never been any question. She found Nathaniel on the boundary of the south field. He had been walking the property lines for the past 2 weeks, methodically reclaiming the knowledge his father had given him one boundary at a time. Josiah walked with him, not guiding, just present. Describing what was visible in the flat, useful language of a man who understood that description was most helpful when it was most precise. Clara came up beside them, and Josiah stepped back with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to read the approach. Letter from heart, she said. Nathaniel heard something in her voice. Walk with me. They walked the boundary line while she told him. All of it, the debt purchase, the timing, the deliberate engineering of her father's crisis. She told it plainly, and he listened without interrupting. The way he always listened completely, as though he had no other purpose in the world at this moment than to receive what she was telling him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. They kept walking. The ground was cold and hard under their feet, and the winter light was thin and flat and honest. They used you, he said. They tried to, she said. They miscalculated what I would do once I was inside. They thought you'd be too frightened to look carefully. Or too grateful, or too young. She paused. Any of those would have worked if they'd been right. But they weren't right, no. She thought about the first morning. The account books on day 3. The moment she had put the irregularities in front of a man she had known for 72 hours and said, someone has been stealing from you. The choice she had made continuously every day since, to see clearly and say plainly what she saw. They built a plan around a version of me that doesn't exist. Nathaniel stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The boundary fence was here. She could see it, the wooden posts her father's father had probably never seen, marking the edge of land that had almost been taken from a family that had held it for 30 years. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want to say it correctly, so I'll take a moment. Clara waited. The wind moved across the field. She waited. When you came into my house, he said, I was a man who had decided his life was effectively over. Not dramatically, I hadn't given up in any active way. I had simply stopped. Stopped expecting things to change. Stopped believing that what I did or did not do had any particular bearing on the outcome. He paused. 3 years of that is a long time. It becomes the shape of a day. The shape of a life if you let it. She did not fill the silence. You walked into my study on day 3, he said, and put a ledger on my desk and told me the truth. No softening, no management, just the truth and the clear expectation that I would do something with it. He stopped. I cannot not tell you what that felt like. To be expected to act. To have someone in my house who simply assumed without question, without accommodation, that I was still capable of responding to reality. Clara looked at him. At the man standing on the boundary of his own land in the winter light, straight and present, and here, fully here, in a way he had not been when she arrived. You were always capable of it, she said. I needed someone to believe that first. Then I'm glad I did. He turned toward her fully, directly, the particular quality of his attention that she had stopped calling approximate, because it was not approximate at all. It was precise. It was the most precise attention she had ever been the subject of. Clara. Nathaniel, she said. His name, his first name for the first time. She had not planned it. It arrived with the same naturalness as the truth always arrived when she stopped managing it. Something in his face changed, opened. Is that a yes to the contract clause? It's a yes to whatever comes after this, she said. The contract clause, the home, all of it. She paused. But I want to renegotiate one more term. Name it. Equal say, she said. In the estate decisions, not consultation, equal say. I've been managing this property for 2 months, and I've earned that standing, and I want it formalized. He almost smiled. Agreed. And I want my name on the account books, officially. Estate manager, not assistant, not companion. Estate manager, he said. It's already in the contract. I want it on the books themselves, in the heading. Done. And Clara. His voice was warm. What else? She thought about it. About the East Wing she had described to him in careful detail, and that he had memorized over 2 evenings, moving through it now without hesitation. About the Sunday at the church and Crane's face when he realized he had miscalculated. About Martha's pastry and Josiah's directness, and Ellis carrying his lamp through the downstairs rooms every night for 30 years, because some things were worth continuing regardless. About her father who had ridden away without looking back, and whom she was going to have to find words for eventually when this was over, and she knew the full shape of what he had been used for. About a paper torn in half on the first morning. About a man who had said, I know I don't have to, and meant it every time. Nothing else, she said. That's all I need. Hart moved on Crane 3 weeks later. The charges were presented to the circuit court in Lexington on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, the news had reached Harlan County with the particular speed of information that powerful people have tried to suppress. Clara heard it from the post writer, who had heard it from the court clerk's wife, who had told approximately everyone she knew. Aldous Crane charged with conspiracy to defraud, suborning forgery, and deliberate financial manipulation. Gideon Cole charged with forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. Daniel Marsh charged as an accessory. Judge Pruitt removed from jurisdiction by order of the circuit court, pending his own investigation. Clara read the post writer's summary to Nathaniel that evening in the study, where she had read him so many things over the past 2 months. And when she finished, he sat with it for a moment, in the way he had when she read him the first account. Irregularities completely still absorbing, letting the full weight of something land before responding. Then he said, Harrison. Also charged, she said. Hart moved on everything at once, so nothing could be quietly settled before the others were aware. And Silas. He's cooperating. He's giving them details on how Cole directed the scheme in exchange for reduced charges. She set the paper down. It's done, Nathaniel. He was quiet. The land is secure, she said. All 4 parcels. The circuit court issued a protective order the same morning. The charges were filed. Nothing can be transferred or encumbered until the case is fully resolved, which is standard, but it means no one can make another attempt while proceedings are ongoing. How long will the proceedings take? Hart says 4 to 6 months for the primary charges, possibly longer for everything connected to Pruitt. She paused. But the estate is safe now. That part is settled. Nathaniel stood. He moved to the window, the same window he had stood at so many times facing the land he had almost lost. And she had watched him do this for 2 months and understood it differently now than she had at the beginning. At the beginning she had thought it was habit. Now she understood it was intention. He stood at that window because the land was out there, and he knew it, and standing at the window was the act of a man who refused to forget what was his. My father's boundary lines, he said. All of them, she said. Intact. He turned from the window. I want to walk them tomorrow. All of them. The full perimeter. That will take most of the day. Yes. Josiah will go with you. And you, he said. Clara looked at him. It's 4 miles. I know how long it is. It'll be cold. Clara. I'll wear my heavy coat, she said. Something in his face did the thing she had come to love. The thing she had stopped not naming sometime in the past 2 weeks. The thing that was neither the dry humor nor the controlled professional warmth, but something that lived underneath both of them. Something that had been there since the first morning and had been growing steadily more visible since the way something grows when it is no longer being suppressed. "Good," he said. "Wear it." The next morning they walked the full perimeter of Whitmore Estate. It took 5 hours. Josiah led naming landmarks and fence posts and the conditions of the boundary markers as they reached each one, and Nathaniel walked with his hand sometimes on the fence line, and sometimes not, with the confidence of a man who had been learning this land by touch and by memory and by the patient, precise descriptions of a woman who had walked it herself, specifically, so she could describe it to him. Clara walked beside him and said the things. Josiah missed the quality of the soil at the south corner, the place where the creek had shifted its course slightly since the last survey, the stand of oak at the east boundary that Nathaniel's father had planted, and that were now large enough to be significant. She described them all, and he listened to all of it, and when they reached the east parcel, the land Crane had wanted for 15 years, the land Cole had planned to strip from a blind man who didn't know he was being robbed. Nathaniel stopped walking and stood still for a moment. "Tell me what it looks like," he said, quietly. She looked at the east parcel. At the land that had nearly been lost, that was good land, productive land that had been in one family's hands for 30 years and was going to stay there. She thought about how to say it. Not just description. He could get description anywhere from any careful person. He had asked her specifically, and she knew what that meant. She told him what it looked like. She told him about the color of the winter grass and the angle of the morning light, and the way the ground rolled toward the creek at the far edge, the texture of the fence posts and the height of the tree line, and the particular quality of stillness that a piece of land has when it is secure. She told him all of it slowly and precisely, the way she had learned to tell him things, with the understanding that words in the right order delivered by the right voice could give a man more than sight. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." "Clara." He turned toward her fully, completely, the full weight of his attention. "I am going to ask you something that is considerably outside the scope of any contract." She waited. "I am going to ask you," he said slowly, "whether you might be willing to be here not as an employee, not as an estate manager or a contractor or a professional with a title on the account books." He paused. "Whether you might be willing to be here as the person this house belongs to, equally alongside me." The east parcel was quiet around them. Josiah had found something requiring his attention approximately 50 yards away. Clara looked at Nathaniel Whitmore. At the man who had torn a paper in half on the first morning and given her a choice when he didn't have to. Who had stood in a parlor doorway and said, "She is not a resource." Who had learned account books by touch because she had believed he could. Who had walked into a churchyard afraid and done it anyway. Who had stood on his own boundary line and asked her to describe it to him because her words were the ones he trusted. She thought about 19 years old and 14 miles and a borrowed mule and a good dress pressed as well as she could manage. She thought about what she had come here expecting and what she had found instead. "Yes," she said, simply. The same word she had used on the first morning when he had asked if she would take the position, and it meant something entirely different now, and she knew that he knew it. "Yes," he exhaled. Just once, quietly, and it was the most complete sound she had heard from him. Relief and certainty, and something warm that did not have a more specific name than what it was. "Good," he said, and offered her his hand, not to guide, not for navigation, but the way you offer someone your hand when you mean it as a simple human thing. When you mean, "Here, walk with me." She took it. They walked back along the boundary line of Whitmore Estate, together through the cold Kentucky morning, through land that was whole and secure, and theirs. And Josiah walked ahead of them, and found reasons to look at fence posts and tree lines and the far middle distance, and the winter light was thin and clear and honest over everything. Years later, people in Harlan County would remember the trial of Aldous Crane as the moment when the shape of things in that county changed, when certain arrangements were disrupted and certain kinds of power were made to answer for themselves. They would remember Gideon Cole's letters read aloud in a Lexington courtroom as a document of patient corruption. They would remember the young woman who had organized the evidence and the blind man who had stood beside her through every step of the proceedings. They would remember, too, the school that opened in the second year on the East Parcel. Clara Bennett Whitmore's school teaching the children of farm workers and tenant families. The reading and writing and arithmetic that she had used to save an estate, and that she believed with the practical conviction of someone who had seen what knowledge could do, was the most durable thing you could put in a person's hands. They would remember the boundary walks. Nathaniel Whitmore walking the perimeter of his land every spring. Sometimes with Josiah, sometimes with Clara, sometimes alone, following the line his father had taught him, and that he had nearly lost, and that he had reclaimed step by step. A man who could not see the land the way his father had, but who knew it precisely and completely in the way that matters more. What they remembered least, because it was the kind of thing that happens quietly and without announcement, was the morning. Clara Bennett had walked into a house that had stopped expecting anything and had simply begun. Without apology, without hesitation, without asking whether she was welcome or wanted or enough. She had simply begun, and the house had come alive around her, and the man in it had come back from wherever he had been, and Whitmore Estate had become what it was always built to be, a place held by people who understood that land is not kept by owning it, but by knowing it, by walking it, by standing on its boundary in the cold morning light and saying, "This is mine, and I will not let it go, and I will spend my life making it worthy of keeping." That was what they built together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.